For Chapter 4, Exercise 1, Installing a New Forest Using Server Manager. In this exercise, we're going to install a new forest named corp.contoso.com by using Server Manager to install Active Directory directory services on Server 1 and then promoting it as our domain controller. So for this exercise, I'm going to be using our Server 2012 and start just following through the steps in the book. The first step is to log onto the server. Normally I do Control-Alt-Delete. I'm using Control-Alt-Insert since it's in a virtual world. And I enter my password. And when I log in, Server Manager will automatically start. After Server Manager begins, I want to click Add Roles and Features. It's just an introductory screen. I click Next. I do want to do the role-based or feature-based installation, so I click Next again. What server do I want to install this on? I'm only working with the one server right now called Server 1, my Server 2012 installation. And now I want to choose Active Directory Domain Services. It's the second option. There's other features that want to be included automatically, including the management tools. This will be very important when we get to Exercise 2. This allows us to remotely administer the second server. I click Add Feature, and I click Next. Other suggestions are included. We're going to accept them and click Next again. We click Next again on the next screen. And finally we choose Install. Watch the progress bar across the top, and it'll tell us when it's complete. When the installation is completed, it will say Installation Succeeded on Server 1. You can then close this window. After you close the window, there's a notification flag up on top. You can click on that to complete the installation, and that's to promote the server to a domain controller. So we've added Active Directory Domain Services, and now we want to make it a domain controller. When I click on there, the wizard comes up, and I can add the domain controller to an existing domain, add a new domain to an existing forest, or create a new forest. And that's the option I want to choose for right now, since I do not have an existing forest. The root forest that we're choosing for this exercise is going to be corp.contoso.com. And then I click Next. It's going to come up, and I then need to do a Directory Services Restore Mode password. The screen might take a few minutes to load. When you are finally able to click in the password field, then you can enter the password. Any password's fine. We'll just use the one we've been using, capital P, $, $W0RD. Need to enter it again. And I can click Next. The next several screens, I just choose the options, the default options. I click Next. The next net BIOS name automatically fills in. And when it does, I can click Next. I choose all the default directories, and I click Next again. Review the selections. I click Next. After it does the prerequisite check, I click Install. After the installation, the server will automatically reboot. This process can take several minutes. Again, when the installation is completed, the server will reboot. Hit Control-Alt-Insert to log back in. As you notice, now you're logging into Corp, which is our domain name, as opposed to logging as a local user account administrator. So what we've done so far is we've installed Active Directory on this server, which is essentially, and we created a new forest, which is essentially creating a new directory, a new database to keep track of all our network resources. We then decided to put it on this machine. We made a domain controller, so we actually put the database on this server. After we log back in, there's a couple things we can see on here then. If I click on local server, You can see I'm now part of a domain called corp.contoso.com. If I look under Active Directory Directory Services, you'll see the servers that have directory services installed on it. And that is the end of exercise 1. For exercise 2, remotely adding an additional domain controller using Windows PowerShell, we're going to be doing things a little bit differently here. So the first thing is that we'll be using a server core environment. So you have to have your Windows Server 2012 core server running. With core, we only have the command prompt, the command line interface we're working with. We're not going to have the GUI environment. In addition to that, we're going to be doing this remotely, so we're going to be doing the install actually from server 1 instead of from server 2. There's a couple things we can do behind the scenes, though, to get things set, and we would have to do this anyways, whether we're installing Active Directory locally or remotely. But what we need to do is actually configure our server to be able to see the server 1 as our domain name services. So later on, when we try to join the domain, it has to know where that domain name comes from. If it doesn't have a DNS, it's not going to resolve that name to an IP address or anything. So the first thing we want to do is log into our server core server. Control-Alt-Insert again will get us to the password. And our password is capital P A $W0RD. As you notice when you log in, you don't get a graphical user interface at all. It's completely command line. But there are some menus that we can work with, command line based menus. The one we're really concentrating on now is sconfig, which is server configuration. And the first thing we want to do is, in fact, change our DNS to be pointing to our server 1, so that when we try to join our domain later on, it can see it and be able to resolve the name. So I choose 8 for DNS settings, for network settings. If I had multiple network cards, each one have a different index number down here on the bottom of the screen. Try to bring this up a little more. And I only have 1, so I'm going to choose number 10. What do you want to do with this? I want to set my DNS server. So that's option number 2 on the bottom. Set DNS servers. I want to set it to be my server 1. A couple ways of doing that, just by going back to my server 1, my Windows Server 2012 server. Any reference to server 1 in the dashboard or local server under ADDS section, it's going to give me my IP address here as well. If I didn't have this running, I can always go to a command line and type in ipconfig, and it'll tell me my IP address as well. It's 192.168.118.60, and that should be my DNS then. That's what I should be pointing to resolve the names. Because when I install Active Directory to begin with, like I just did in the last server, it's also installing DNS on that server as well to help resolving those names. So I type in 192.168.118.60, and I hit enter. The preferred DNS is set, so I hit OK. And it's asking for an alternate. Normally you would have an alternate, so if one DNS server is down, you can always point it to another one, so you can always resolve names. We don't have a second one, so I'm going to hit enter to leave it blank. When we're all done with this, I can return to the main menu by hitting number 4. And now at this point, I want to be joining the domain. Joining the domain just makes me part of the network that I can be administered by and remotely accessed by. I'm not actually installing Active Directory at this point. That I will be doing later on remotely, as well as eventually making this another domain controller as well, making a copy of that database that exists on server 1 and putting it on server 2 as well. That's going to be for redundancy and for efficiency. But right now, all I'm doing is joining the domain so it can be controlled. So under number 1, it says domain or workgroup. Right now it's underneath a workgroup, means it's essentially a standalone server. I hit 1 to change that. And I want to join a domain. So I hit D for the domain. It's asking what domain that I want to join, and I want to join the corp.contoso.domain. And I hit enter. And it needs an authorized domain / username. Well, the domain name is corp, and the user that's going to give me access to do that is the administrator account. So I can use corp / administrator. And it wants the password, which would be capital P-A $$W0RD. That's the password for that user on the domain. What's really happening at this point is it's collecting all the information to be ready to be put into a PowerShell command. You can do this whole thing of joining a domain, netdom, join domain, and authorize username, what workgroup, what domain you've been joining, and everything right in PowerShell. This just sort of helps automate it a little bit, makes it a little bit easier for us to interact with instead of having to remember all the parameters. But that's really what's happening behind the scenes. Do you want to change the computer name before restarting the computer? No, at this point I don't, because it already is server 2, which is exactly what I want it to be. Many times when we're installing a server, it just becomes win dash and a bunch of characters as a computer name, and then obviously we would want to change the computer name at the same time. You want the computer name changed before joining a domain, because once it's joined, it's much more difficult to change a name, and it gets very confusing. So you should always change the computer name before or at the same time as joining a domain. So I'm going to click No. You must restart your computer then to apply these changes. Do you want to restart now? Yes, I do. And you wait for the server to restart. After the server restarts, we can go ahead and hit Control-Alt-Insert again to log in. So capital P-A $$W0RD. I can go to sconfig again to see the configuration of the server, and I can see that I am part of the domain called corp.contoso.com. I'm pretty much on this server right now, and so I can exit here, exit the command line, number 15, and I'm just at the regular command prompt. I can leave this server, think of this as some kind of remote location. It's just out there, and I don't need to really interact with it anymore as I install Active Directory now, and as I make it into a domain controller, which is all it is adding a copy of the database onto the server. I want to switch back to my server, 2012, server 1. I'm going to open up PowerShell, which I already have opened. I'm going to change the font to make it a little bit easier to see. And step 19 has us do the first step of getting our server ready. That's by installing Active Directory. It says use the invoke command together with the install Windows feature to remotely install Active Directory directory services on server 2. It doesn't give the complete syntax. The complete syntax is invoke command, and you have to tell it where you're going to be issuing the command. I want to do it on the computer that's named server 2. And then you put the actual command that you want to invoke in the curly braces. And it's an install Windows feature, and the feature is AD domain services. Close it with a brace. So it's going to invoke this command onto this server. When you click enter, it may take a moment, but if successful, it should show the status bar across the top of the screen. Give it a few minutes to complete. When it's finally completed, it'll tell you that it is completed. It does give you a warning. It's about Windows automatic updating is not enabled. We're not going to worry about that at this point. The next step that we want to do is actually make it a domain controller. So we're going to take a copy of the domain database and make it over here for replication purposes, for backups, for redundancy. The command that we're going to use is invoke command on the computer that's named server 2. And then within braces, I want to tell what I'm going to invoke. Install ADDS domain controller. So I'm going to make a domain controller. And these are parameters, not additional things that I'm installing. It is the domain name. It needs to know which domain name this is going to apply to. Don't worry about the word wrap. It will work out right. Just keep typing. It's not a new command when you get to the next line. You can always arrow left and right to make sure that everything is right, though, which is a good thing to do. Contoso.com. It's also going to need to know the administrator and the administrator's password to allow this to be becoming a domain controller. A couple of ways of doing that. One way is for you to actually enter the password by using the get credential command or option. You have to tell what user you want to get the credential for. It is Corp Administrator. And I close the brace when I'm done. When I hit enter, it should prompt me for the Corp Administrator's password, capital P-A $W0RD. When I hit enter, one thing it's going to ask for is a safe mode administrator password. It could be anything that you want. We'll just keep all the passwords the same. So it's capital P-A $W0RD. And I hit enter. The target server will be configured as a domain controller and restarted when the operation is complete. Do you want to continue? Yes, I do. Yes is the default, so you only have to hit enter. It'll go through the whole process. It will eventually restart your server, server 2, not server 1, which is the server you're on. When it's complete, it'll give you a status of success. To check the status of it on our server now, I can close PowerShell. I'll just minimize PowerShell. I am back on the server manager. Let me click on the dashboard. I can click on all servers at this point, and this is my server pool. I want to add server 2 to my server pool so I can manage it as well now. It talks about that in step 22 where it says add server 2 to the server pool. In order to add server 2 to the server pool, you want to click on manage up on top. You want to add a server and let it find now. After I click find now, the servers that it can find within the Corp domain should show up. Server 1 is obviously part of the pool already. I want to click on server 2 and click on the right arrow to actually move it to the selected area. I click OK, and now it's going to add server 2 to the pool. It's going to log into it and make sure the connection's there. And now it tells me it's online. So I can manage and manipulate either one of these servers. If I click on server 1, I'm able to scroll through, see the events, see the services that are installed on there. Going down to the bottom, it has performances and then roles and features. It shows that Active Directory domain services are on here as well. I can click on server 2, and now it gives me all the information for server 2. So I can manage and manipulate all of these, both of these servers from one location. Another way of looking at your domain controllers and seeing what you have out there is under Tools. We have Active Directory users and computers. And it brings up a view of our Active Directory. Here's our organization, or here's our domain, corp.contoso.com. And inside of here, we actually have a domain controllers organizational unit, a container for domain controllers. It tells us that we have 2 of them. If one of these was a read-only domain controller, or if I had multiple of these, it'd be listed here as read-only. So it's a nice place to review what domain controllers you have and what if they're full domain controllers or read-only domain controllers. And that is the end of exercise 2.